Let's Talk Native is produced at the LTN Studios on the Cattaraugus territory of the Seneca Nation. We break all the rules for Native media by peeling back the layers of assimilation and indoctrination. We may step on a few toes through our examination of culture, art, politics, history, and identity. But the real goal here is to bring our people together by breaking down what separates us. So, welcome to Let's Talk Native with John Kane.
Sigo, I'm John Kane, and this is Let's Talk Native. Hey, of course, when I take a break from doing this podcast, I always have to apologize for that break, and I do once again. But I do want to remind people that I do this podcast, and this podcast originated as my radio show. But then I did take on a radio show. For those of you who listen to my Let's Talk Native podcast and are not familiar, which I'm not sure how that could be, but if you're not familiar, I do a radio show that's in New York City and Washington, D.C., and it's called Resistance Radio. That show goes up as a podcast as well. So if you're ever missing me from a Let's Talk Native standpoint, I weekly do my show. I do this show live in New York on Thursdays. It rebroadcasts on Fridays in Washington, D.C., and that goes up as a podcast. So for those who are catching me on Facebook live stream, you're pretty much aware of that. But I know that I've gotten a few messages from folks who listen to the Let's Talk Native podcast, wondering why I haven't done one in a while. So in the absence of doing that podcast, I do want to assure you that I'm doing a show on a weekly basis on the radio that itself is a podcast as well. So you're going to hear me. If you want to on either one. I'm going to cover some issues today that I've talked about on previous shows that I've posted a lot about on social media, but I haven't done this podcast on this issue. So let me start off by saying on Monday, September 30th, that is being commemorated, I guess, for lack of a better word, as Orange Shirt Day, or National Day of Truth and Reconciliation. I'm not so sure about the that second name, but there are Native people across U.S. and Canada, and I suspect globally, that will be donning orange shirts. Now, I will tell you that I will not be wearing a shirt that says "Every Child Matters," and I'm going to tell you why. I think we screwed up on the slogan. Look, when Black Lives Matter became a thing, the response from white people to Black Lives Matter was that all lives matter. And nobody's doubting or questioning whether all lives should matter. But the reason Black Lives Matter was a thing, and the reason that slogan stuck, was because they were trying to assert that Black Lives Matter too. Well, I think for us to come out of the gate to address residential schools, boarding schools, and frankly, any issue that affects our children, from foster care to even missing and murdered Indigenous women and boys, girls, children, all of that. I think for us to come out of the gate with a slogan that says "Every child matters," we kind of missed the point. So I would much rather see the slogan be shifted towards "Every Native child matters," or "Our children matter," "Native children matter." I don't know, something like that, because we're not questioning whether all children should matter or not. I just think that we didn't learn from what that whole Black Lives Matter, which is the origins of these kinds of slogans anyway, right? I just don't think that we learned from it. So I do have a problem with this slogan of "Every child matters," and again, not because I don't think every child should matter. But the fact of the matter, the reason we're even doing these, having this slogan and having this conversation, is because clearly our children were not being treated in a manner that was consistent with the way children should be treated. And of course, we're talking about residential schools primarily. Now, I'm not going to do a whole show about shirts, but I did say that if I was going to wear an orange shirt on that day, I would likely wear one that says something like, "Deb Haaland, you should be ashamed of yourself." Let me explain. Well, first, let me back up even a little farther. Look, the fact that this is born out of this National Day of Truth and Reconciliation, and that's more of a Canadian thing, right? Because they already had their Truth and Reconciliation Commission, and they've been celebrating or commemorating these days for a while. They've done a final report and that kind of stuff. But let's be honest, Canada has not stepped up. They have not reconciled a damn thing. In fact, they haven't been truthful either. So even though checks have been written and there are things that have been done, the overall list of demands or action items that came out of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission on the Canadian side, almost none of them were followed. And the big issue that is in the news almost every single day or once a week anyway is that we're seeing more and more of these residential school sites that have been investigated with ground penetrating radar to determine that there are unmarked graves there, mass graves, whatever. There are children buried in those sites that have never been documented. And at this point, it's almost 10,000 children on the Canadian side alone. Now, I gotta remind people that according to the official tally, there's less than 140 schools that existed on the Canadian side. There was probably many more than that. It's kind of like on the U.S. side. I'll talk about that next. But as far as Canada is concerned, there were 100, just shy of 140 residential schools that were funded by the Canadian government specifically. Now they've only investigated a couple of dozen of these schools, not even half of them, not even nowhere near all of the schools, and yet they've come up with over 9,000, 98, I think last number I saw, and I don't know where, I can't quantify where all the numbers come from, but last number I saw was like 9,800 children are suspected of being buried at these sites. And again, we're only talking dozens of schools, and we're already almost at 10,000. Now, I'm not even suggesting that those schools all need to be dug, those grounds need to be dug up. I have a different feeling about when we return to our mother. And I know some people want to repatriate the bones and that kind of stuff. And look, if that's what people want to do, I don't oppose that. But my sense is that if you believe that you've been able to identify that your children and I got to clear this up because this is kind of it's an awkward thing. We're talking about children here, but these children were the relatives of our grandparents. So we're talking about children, but we're talking about children sometimes generations old, right? Generations ago. So they are essentially the cousins, the sisters, the brothers of our aunts, our great aunts, our grandparents, our great grandparents. These residential schools existed for over 100 years on the U.S. and the Canadian side. So when we talk about children, it's sometimes a little awkward because we're not talking about the children that we see now. We're talking about children that have long since perished. And not only these ones who perished at these schools, but they perished because these things went on for generations. So even the ones who survived the schools in terms of living through them and growing to adulthood, most of the kids who ever went to these schools are now gone. There's handfuls of survivors of these residential schools left. But these things went on for 7 generations. I mean, we use that expression, 7 generations, but we have to acknowledge that these things went on for 7 generations that these schools occurred. So the idea that they built these schools, and the U.S. is the one that modeled this whole idea, schools that would be geared towards forced assimilation. And when I say forced, I mean violently forced. Beatings, torture, murder. And of course, the abuses that come with having unfettered access and control of children, sexual abuse, rape, abortion, sterilization, all of the things that almost identify or are defined as genocide. All the 5 issues associated that define what genocide is internationally, these residential schools represented all 5 of them, and beyond that. And to say that these schools were built with the sole purpose of killing the Indian within us, kill the Indian, save the man, the idea that they would try to kill our identity in the hopes that what would remain once that was stripped away from us, any sense of native identity, that once that was all stripped away, that we would somehow be of value to Canada and the United States. That's what the goal was. And that's not sugarcoating it. And that's not, and I'm not even, this isn't hyperbolic. I'm not exaggerating. That's what the goal was. Forced assimilation. So as we enter this, it's only a week away. This notion of Orange Shirt Day. I think we have to specify that we're talking about our children. And look, I realize they say every child matters, and we've got little Native kids on it, and we've got Native imagery. So the assumption is that we're talking about Native kids. But I'm saying say it. But here's the other thing that needs to be said, and that's what I referred to in the beginning. Deb Haaland, you should be ashamed of yourself. I mean, for all the people on both the U.S. and the Canadian side, anytime a Native person gets propped up to one of these high-level positions within the U.S. or Canadian government, there's a segment of our population that falls all over themselves. Oh, isn't that great? It's so wonderful. Well, it isn't. Because all that means is that somebody from our own stock, from our people, are now one of theirs. And that's exactly what it is. Deb Haaland was not appointed as the Interior Secretary by Native people. In fact, when she ran for Congress, she wasn't elected by Native people. I'm not saying Native people didn't vote for her. I'm sure they did. But it was white people that got her elected. And it was a white man in the White House that put her in that position as the Interior Secretary. And she served at his pleasure, not ours. She didn't represent a seat at the table for us. And in fact, she didn't even open the table up to give us seats at her table while she was the one that was chairing the whole thing. But let me get to the point. About a month ago now, the Interior Department, so the Assistant Secretary, who is essentially the head of the Bureau of Indian Affairs in the Interior Department, Brian Newland, prepared and released what they were calling the final report on residential schools. Now, Deb Haaland she did her press releases years ago about how she was going to investigate and hold the United States accountable, and there was going to be transparency about, kind of like that Truth and Reconciliation thing on the Canadian side. She made all these promises. Her first report was almost a slap in the face, but the final report is even more of a slap in the face. For one thing, let me be clear. The numbers that they offered in this report, and they did offer numbers. When they gave numbers on the number of residential schools, they said there was, approximately 417. Mind you, Canada only had less than 140. 417 federally funded residential schools that operated in the 100 years that they only looked at. The 100 years was between 1871 and 1969. Now, to be clear, the United States passed the Civilization Fund Act in like 1819 and started funding schools that were already in existence, run by churches primarily, to do this purpose. But see, they ignored the first 50 years. They only talked about that 98 years, I guess, between 1871 and 1969. And again, sometimes you got to put things in context. I was in school in 1969. It wasn't one of those schools. So we aren't talking ancient history. I know some of you young people, and man, I hope there's some young people watching this. You're saying, yeah, you look pretty ancient to me. Well, look, I'm not as young as I used to be. But I'm old enough to have been alive during the period of time that Native kids were still being ripped from their homes and sent to these residential schools. And of course, it wasn't just that. There was foster care, kids that were ripped from their homes and put into orphanages. These residential schools weren't necessarily orphanages. I'm not saying kids didn't go from these schools to white homes. They did. But they weren't the same thing as the state-run foster care systems, the adoption agencies or orphanages and that stuff. The whole thing was a debacle. In fact, that was the justification for the United States passing the Indian Child Welfare Act, which was another debacle all by itself, which still didn't empower us to have control over our own kids. It just put federal guidelines on how the states had to treat the removal and placement of a Native child. And it was pretty much lauded as the end of residential schools and the end of the abuses of foster care. And it wasn't. In fact, it wasn't either. But I'm not going to dwell on that. I still want to talk about the report. So this report did give a number. They said 417 federally funded schools existed, and but here's the crazy part. This is a report prepared by Brian Newland, released by Deb Haaland, Native woman, and both these guys are Native. So let's be clear: Brian Newland and Deb Haaland are both Native people working for the federal government. They suggested that they had identified at least 18,000 children that went to those schools. 417 schools, and over a period of 100 years, and they were only able to identify 18,000 kids. I mean, these were schools. These were schools that had records. They were run by churches that kept records. So if this was the final report, and then you throw a precursor to your numbers, like at least 18,000 students. Okay, well, all right. So you're saying, well, what's at most? What's the higher number? What's the real number? No, there's no real numbers here. And in fact, it actually gets a little worse because the first report suggested that that they had identified approximately 500 kids that died in these schools, which was insane, an insanely small number. And they ended up coming back with about 900, under 1,000, but between 900 and 1,000 kids that they say they've identified that died at these schools. Now, that is such an insane number, especially if you put it in comparison to what we're seeing on the Canadian side. You had 3 times as many schools, and you're saying, and only a fraction of those schools on the Canadian side have been investigated, and they've already identified what is potentially over 10,000 or around 10,000 grave sites that were previously unknown. And you, Deb Haaland and Brian Newland, you're going to suggest that on the U.S. side, with 417 schools that operated a program that operated for over 100 years, that less than 1,000 children died at these schools? That's ridiculous. Carlisle Indian School, the flagship of the Kill the Indian, Save the Man program, they had over 200 marked graves. We don't know how many unmarked graves there are, but they also sent children home to die because they thought it was looking bad for them to have them die on their watch. So guys like Preston McBride and others who have done research on this have suggested that Carlisle Indian School may have been responsible for over 700 children dying in their care. So whether they died on the train ride home or died once getting home or their bodies were sent home, that doesn't get you off the hook. I'll maintain that there will be, if there's ever a final analysis done here, a real final report, that there will be over 10,000 children that will have been discovered to have been buried at these schools. In mass graves, unmarked graves, in marked graves that are no longer bear any markings at all. And that's the children who were enrolled. There is story after story after story about abortions that occurred at these schools because these girls were being raped by clergymen. This clergy sex abuse scandal that rocked the United States from Boston to Los Angeles and across Canada. In all likelihood, much of this breeding ground for that perversion happened in these residential schools. Because we know it happened in these residential schools. And many of those priests and clergymen were shifted. They were never punished, and they certainly weren't prosecuted. They just got sent to other churches. And so what they did to Native kids, they probably did to some white kids. So this is the absurdity of this report. So yeah, Deb Haaland, Brian Newland, you should be ashamed of yourself. But here's the crazy part is that I've heard no outrage from Native people. So we're all going to put on a bunch of orange shirts on next Monday, and we're not going to raise hell about that final report or the fact that neither Canada nor the United States will step up to help really evaluate and investigate how many children died in those schools. And we're just going to wear orange shirts and what? Commiserate together? I'm not I'm not saying that's not necessary. I think sharing the pain and trying to get some of that out, I'm not opposed to that. But I am opposed to taking this lying down. Because I'm going to tell you, the report from Newland and Hallen gets worse. Yeah, it gets worse. Because here's what they did. See, on the Canadian side, they spent about, I don't know, $2 or $3 billion cutting checks to people to try to make it all go away. It didn't make it go away. And again, didn't follow any of the action items that came out of that Truth and Reconciliation Commission, a commission report that called it genocide, albeit cultural genocide. And again, let me say this. There's no such thing as cultural genocide. If you are wiping out a people's culture with the intent to make those people no longer exist as a distinct people, that's not cultural genocide. It's genocide. But it's not like calling it cultural genocide means they took away our beadwork or even just our language. No, these children had their names changed. They had their language stripped away from them. Anything that identified them as native kids, as native people, they were taught that their culture was satanic, that it was evil, that it was wrong, and you were going to burn in hell if you didn't adopt their ways, their Christian ways. Their Christian ways. So we can't just call it cultural genocide. Let me say it again. Killing a people with the intent to destroy them as a people is genocide. Committing physical abuse, psychological abuse, sexual abuse with the intent to destroy a people is genocide. Creating any conditions, and this is where you could call cultural genocide, I guess. Creating any conditions that would strip away the national or the cultural identity of a people so they would no longer be those people is genocide. Taking children from one group and placing them within another group is genocide. And doing anything that would interfere with reproductive rights, including abortions and sterilization, which occurred at these schools, is genocide. Those are the 5 definitions of genocide. It's almost like they used those definitions as the basis for the residential school policy, or vice versa. And the crazy part is, the definition of genocide was not drawn from what was done at these residential schools. It was drawn out of issues related to Europe, not over what was happening in the U.S. or Canada or South America or Australia or New Zealand or Africa or India or Hawaii, the Hawaiian Kingdom, which had its own disproportionate number for the size of that landmass, a disproportionate number of these residential schools to kill the native Hawaiian and try to turn them into something else. But see, this is what was done. But what's being done now with this final report, again, on the Canadian side, they issue checks. You know, some people were getting, I don't know, I don't even know what the numbers were. I've heard numbers that were somewhere between $10,000 and $15,000. And I don't know how you had to go about qualifying for that. But in the overall scheme of things, I think Canada spent between $2 and $3. Geez, I don't even know what it was. Yeah, $2 and $3 million or something. Not a big. It wasn't a big number. Okay, let's just put it that way. No, I'm sorry. It might have been billion. It might have been billion. So, but it's still not a big number. But see, on the U.S. side, they weren't going to try to come up with any analysis to determine what were the damages. I mean, financial damages, or just even really identifying what this school program, what this policy did to Native people. I mean, there's some talk about it. They made like 8 recommendations in the end, which included things like seeing what the existing effects of those are. Forget about what was done. They want to say, well, how are Native people affected by the residential schools today? What's the legacy of the damages? So that they talked about, but they've never gone through, and nor are they even recommending to go through and put a price tag or even anything really definitive to the damages, to the loss, to the harm. Look, if a company produces a chemical that harms people, there is a very thorough and detailed process by which they try to assess the penalty that company should be have inflicted on it for doing that kind of harm to people, for the damages of their activity, of their negligence, or of, even if it isn't negligence, if it's worse, if it was intentional. So there's a whole process, and there are law firms that do this just for a living, assess damages. There are judges who are called upon to do these assessments. That's not what the Interior Department did here. No, they weren't going to even attempt to determine what was lost in terms of lives, the damages that were inflicted on the individuals who survived, the losses that would carry on generation after generation, after 7 generations of these policies, that would affect things like suicide rates, substance abuse, self-esteem, the ability to carry yourselves. Of course, our sovereignty was necessarily diminished during this period of time. So not only were you attacking individuals in the form of children, but you were trying to destroy our autonomy. We experienced the largest period of land loss during that 100 years. And it's not a coincidence. It's not like, oh, well, that was just happening while this was happening. No, there's cause and effect there. We experienced the largest loss of natural resource or access or control of any natural. I mean, we had all this stuff stripped away from us as they were trying to kill the Indian to save the man. I mean, when I hear that expression, kill the Indian, save the man, I'm thinking, kill us to save them, the man. I know that's not probably what they were created that slogan for, but that's what it turns out to be. But no, that's not what this Interior Department did. Here's what they decided to do. They knew that they were going to have to make some recommendations about what to do to compensate or to make this wrong right. And don't get me wrong, Deb Haaland and Brian Newland, they call it an atrocity. They call it bad. They never once called it genocide, though. No, they stayed away from that term completely. And keep in mind, most of the genocide that the United States inflicted against Native people happened before the word was even developed, but not all of it. That concept was developed in the 40s. There was still 20 plus years of residential schools in existence since the term was developed and those definitions that I talked about. I don't know how anybody could have looked at those 5 definitions of genocide and then not looked sideways and said, holy crap, look what we did. But no, they didn't. They didn't do it. And neither did Deb Haaland, our Indian princess sitting in the White House with Joe Biden, or Brian Newland. Here's what they did. They decided they would calculate how much the United States spent in the commission of this crime. How much money was appropriated through Congress towards these residential schools. So rather than assessing the damages, they just said, well, how much did it cost us to do this to these people? And when I say cost, I mean, how much did we have to pay to do this? Not what was the net cost. I mean, can you imagine? Again, let me use that chemical company example again. If you only had to ask that company, well, how much did you spend to harm all these people? And not put any value on the lives that were harmed, or the land that was damaged, or the land that was lost. Not do any of that assessment. Just say, well, how much did you spend to do it? That's what Deb Haaland and Brian Newland did. They said, we're going to calculate, and we're going to adjust it for inflation, not to this year, but to last year. So the last 3% inflation rate wasn't even going to be in the factor. We're going to figure out how much they spent. And they came up with a number that everybody oohed and awed about. They said $23.3 billion the United States spent committing this genocide. And they put in the report that they believe an equivalent amount to that $23.3 billion should be spent to fulfill their recommendations, their 8 recommendations, which, and I'm not opposed to them writing checks to individuals, but that doesn't solve the problem. Look, in the overall scheme of things, we're never going to get the lives back. The vast majority, 90%, 99% of all the children who were harmed by these schools are gone now. We can't get them back. We can't give them anything back. The few survivors of those schools, and then the descendants of, and we're all descendants of those survivors in one way or another, writing us a check, and what is that going to do? So we can turn around and spend it back in your stores? I've said for several years, since I first heard Deb Haaland talk about her commitment to this issue, I said, I don't want truth and reconciliation. I want truth and restoration. I want our sovereignty acknowledged and restored. I want land back, land restored. I want our distinction. I want our rights to engage native to native, to be unencumbered by the states and by the federal government. That's what I want. I don't want a check. We can make our own checks. We can assert our own presence, our own futures, if you just get the hell out of the way. Look, I don't even have to get into a long diatribe on this day, on this show, about what U.S. policy has done to destroy us economically. We're only talking about residential schools here. We're not going to talk about what they did to the Osage. Oh, by the way, they were ripping kids away from the Osage that same time that they were deeming them too incompetent to have their own wealth. I'm not going to talk about how they deemed us too incompetent to run our own gaming industries, so they put the states in our casinos, where they ripped away half the revenue, like Kathy Hochul's done, Andrew Cuomo before her. I don't even have to get into the failures of the last 30 years of Interior Departments. I'm only talking about this Interior Department. Deb Haaland and Brian Newland. Shame on you for releasing at least numbers. Shame on you for doing that. Shame on you for whitewashing one of the biggest crimes committed. I mean, and it's definable. I mean, this isn't like saying, well, this, racism is a crime and, the effects of, no, this is genocide that is definable. It's definable. I mean, there are records. Apparently, these guys don't know how to come up with them. But there are people who have been investigating the deaths. I mean, again, I mentioned Preston McBride, who's done an analysis on just, I think, 3 or 4 schools across the U.S. I don't think he went to the Canadian side, just the U.S. side. And various sizes, just to kind of get the percentages of loss of life. The deaths at, the deaths at these schools. That's what his studies have been. He's got a 900-page report that talked about the lethality of 4 of these schools. Look, the mortality rate was over 50% at some times during this 100 years on the U.S. and Canadian side. But for those schools run by churches, that didn't really matter, because they could make the claim that they were there not to save the man, but to save the soul. This this intangible thing that they could just claim to have done. Once we baptize them, we save their soul. It doesn't matter if they get raped and murdered or killed or died on the way trying to run away to go home. It doesn't matter. We saved their soul. Mission accomplished. I am outraged by this final report. Yeah, I'm a little bit bothered by the "Every Child Matters" slogan, but that doesn't. I just think that was we messed that up. But there's nothing that compares to the silence that has come in the wake of this final report from Deb Haaland and Brian Newland. And that makes it not just unforgivable to those two individuals and their staffs that were a part of this. I mean, look, because there's Native people littered across this whole process that are still just praising Deb Haaland and Brian Newland for their work. I mean, it's like this great strategy. I mean, and they actually, there's an expression they call the pedagogy of the oppressed or whatever else. And it talks about using our own people to oppress our own people. This is oppression because suppression of the truth is still oppression. It still is. And that's what Deb Haaland and Brian Newland are responsible for. But you know what? They're not the only ones that are responsible for a travesty here. Every one of you Native journalists, or so-called Native journalists, who ignored this and refused to come out and speak out about this, that's unforgivable too. Indian Country Today, National Native News, every one of them. I mean, just cite those as a few examples. There's dozens of websites and podcasts and media sources across the internet, on television. I mean, Aboriginal People's Television Network, APTN, on the Canadian side. How did Canada not even say, "Oh man, look what the U.S. did"? I mean, because at the end of the day, there are people on the U.S. side who think, "Oh yeah, Canada was way worse towards Native people than the U.S. side." No, they weren't. And this report just shows you the lie that they have brought Native people into to help perpetuate that lie. Again, if there's ever a thorough investigation, there will be tens of thousands of children discovered to have died at these schools. Tens of thousands. And the fact that this Interior Department couldn't even tell you how many kids went to these schools, I mean, it's insane. It's absurd. And let me tell you this. That's not even all the schools. I'm talking to you here from the Cattaraugus Territory of Seneca Nation. Thomas Indian School right here isn't even one of those schools. It was considered a state-funded school. Funded first by the state's education department, and then ultimately funded by their board of charities. Because why would a school be funded by the board of charities? Because New York State had deemed our children, no, I take it back. They deemed us as a people as handicapped. We were mentally disabled by virtue of being Native. That's what New York State, that's how they viewed us. And that's how the feds did too. That's how you come up with making us wards of the state, because of our incompetence, our ignorance, our primitive nature. That's what New York State did. So they thought that Native kids need to be ripped from their homes and sent to the state-run boarding schools because they were irredeemable. That's what they called our children, the irredeemable children of New York. That's what they called us. And they thought, well, they're pretty much irredeemable, but maybe we can do something and make them unskilled laborers or something. Maybe we can put a gun in their hands and a helmet on their head and set them off to a battlefield, which is what they did. Look, I am outraged by this, and if you're listening to this show and you are not outraged as well, look, and I always have to say this, don't take my word for this stuff. Read what Indian Country Today wrote about the report. They praised it. Read what native media. If you don't want to go to the report itself, which I advise you to do, just read what was written about it. And if you're not pissed, then I don't. Then I don't even want to talk to you. I mean, this is so outrageous. What has come out of this report? That as I look till next Monday, an Orange Shirt Day, I don't know. I don't even know how to feel about it, because every child doesn't matter. This report proves it. Our children, our people didn't matter. The fact that you can commit this crime and then only decide you want to calculate how much it costs to commit the crime? You want to lowball every single number and ignore the intergenerational trauma? And again, in the recommendations, they don't even want to talk about what the actual losses were. They just want to talk about, well, what are the current impacts? You know, how have they struggled? How do they struggle economically today? Well, what about the economies that were destroyed? Our trade and commerce, our ability to sustain ourselves. You destroyed our people as children, and then you had the gall to say that we were drunks? And I get that today. For those of you who follow me on social media, anytime I get engaged with somebody over the mascot issue, ultimately somebody that is trying to say that they have the right to call themselves Indians or warriors or savages or raiders, they say, well, you guys are just a bunch of drunks anyway. They always come back to it. They can't not go there. Look, we do lead in a lot of categories that we should not be proud of. But make no mistake about it, we also lead in categories like death by cop. We lead as a percentage of our population, we die at a higher rate at the hands of law enforcement than anybody else. No, you can cherry pick a certain age group and see, oh yeah, well, black people lead in the 17 to 21 age group. Not that I'm trying to compete. Yeah, we lead in a lot of those categories because abject poverty that exists on our territories and still exists. I mean, I'm not saying that every place is as poor as the others, but the abject poverty that exists is policy driven. It was created. We didn't have homeless people before white folks showed up. Our life expectancy wasn't the lowest on the continent before white people showed up. We didn't have alcohol and substance abuse problems before white people showed up. Hell, they requisitioned alcohol as a part of the treaty making process. I mean, the very act of coercion was embedded into the whole process. The laws that we are still ruled over by are slave era laws. This is the world that we live in and that we're fighting back against. But I will say, we're not fighting hard enough. Because if you're not outraged about the final report by Brian Newland and Deb Haaland, then apparently you're fitting that mold that people are creating. They say, oh yeah, you just want to paint yourself as the victim. I'm not a victim. I'm pissed. Because I'm not a victim. But my relatives were. And my fight is for their honor. We're not wearing these orange shirts next Monday to make a fashion statement or to show that we love our children. We're supposed to be wearing these orange shirts on Monday because of the crimes that were committed against children for 100 years. Our children, us as children, for 100 years. So yeah, I'm pissed, and I guess I'm just as pissed because others aren't. Not the journalists, the native journalists. I haven't heard a single statement. I haven't heard a statement from one native government. In fact, even the activist community. Where the hell are the rest of you? I mean, I know somebody else has got to be saying this. It would be impossible that there aren't more native voices out there. But damn, I can't find them. So if you listen to this podcast, please reach out to me and connect me up with the other people who are pissed off about this report. Because look, we got to make some noise here. I mean, look, Hallen's done. She's already said that, after this election cycle, she's quitting because apparently she accomplished everything she wanted to accomplish. I guess if posing for magazine covers was what you were after, she's the most photographed interior secretary of all times, U.S. history. But she has been derelict in her responsibility to the interior. And don't get me wrong, she didn't work for us. I don't believe that she had an obligation to us specifically. That's not why she was put there. She was put there to silence us, not to serve us. And boy, did Joe Biden do that right. He called it. I'm going to put a native person in there, and everybody's just going to be so happy that I did that they'll never criticize her. Well, I'm not in that group. So I will say, I'm going to keep pushing this issue. I hope others will too. Yeah, I'm pissed, and I hope more of you will be. I want to thank you for listening. I know I say it all the time when I do one of these podcasts that I hope to start doing them more frequently on a more of a regular basis, and I'm going to try. I'm going to try. So bear with me. Again, if you listen to this show, please know that I do a radio show on WBII in New York City and on WPFW in Washington, D.C. I do that on a weekly basis. I put it up. It goes up. But again, if you want to look for that podcast, you have to look for Resistance Radio with John Kane. Please check it out. And so even if I miss a week here or a month here on Let's Talk Native, I'm always going to come back and do this again. I'm always going to come back for this to do a Let's Talk Native, and I'll try not to be as frequent as I've been. I want to thank you for listening. I'm John Kane, and this is Let's Talk Native.